Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. And welcome to the 104th Asian Impact webinar. My name is Abdul Abiad. I'm Deputy Chief Economist here at the Asian Development Bank. And today we're launching the ADB's latest flagship report, the 2025 Asia-Pacific Climate Report titled Unlocking Nature for Development. This report was an ADB-wide effort led by two ADB departments, the Economic Research and Development Impact Department, to which I belong, and the Climate Change and Sustainable Development Department. Let me now invite my colleague, Eugene Zhukov, the Director General of the Climate Change and Sustainable Development Department, to provide some opening remarks. Eugene, floor is yours.
Thank you, Abdul, and good morning, colleagues, partners, and friends. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to the launch of the Asia-Pacific Climate Report for 2025, which is subtitled Unlocking Nature for Development. Let me start by also, like Abdul, recognizing the close collaboration that made this report possible between the ADB's Economic Research and Development Impact Department, the Climate Change and Sustainable Development Department, and colleagues across sector and country teams. This report reflects what ADB does best when we work together, combining research, policy, and operations to drive meaningful change. Today's launch comes at a pivotal moment. Asia-Pacific stand at crossroads of two defining challenges, climate change and nature loss. The region faces mounting pressures from extreme weather, biodiversity decline, and environmental degradation. But it also holds some of the world's most valuable natural assets. Its forests, reefs, grasslands, and wetlands are not only ecological treasures, they're pillars of our economies and livelihoods. We sometimes forget that nature is the hidden infrastructure of our prosperity. 3/4 of region's economic output, or about $21 trillion US, depends on healthy ecosystems. When mangroves are lost, coastlines weaken. When rivers are polluted, public health and industry suffer. When forests disappear, we lose not only biodiversity, but fiscal resilience and food security. This is why ADB's message in this report is both simple and profound. Nature is not a cost, it's a capital. It's a productive capital that underpins growth, jobs, and stability. Unlocking Nature for Development report shows that by properly valuing nature, we can transform how economies grow and how finance flows. The report calls for a shift from short-term project funding to long-term systematic financing that integrates nature to the heart of economic planning and investment. The report urges countries to upgrade the economic operating systems, i.e. strengthening governance, policy, and data so that the public and private finance reinforce rather than erode natural capital. This approach is not about creating new silos. It's about integrating nature into fiscal frameworks, financial markets, and development planning, the same systems that already drive national priorities. In practice, that means aligning subsidies, taxes, and investment incentives with sustainability goals, strengthening natural capital accounting and data, and using finance to reward conservation and restoration, not degradation. The report also lays out a high-level 10-year differentiated roadmap, recognizing that countries start from different points. Some are ready to launch the biodiversity credit markets or green taxonomies. Others may need to begin with basic valuation, accounting, and institutional reforms. What matters is that every country can take a first step toward a system that values nature as a capital, as a productive capital. And this is not just theory. Across the regions, we're already seeing what works. In our host country, Philippines, mangrove rehabilitation protects communities from storms while creating new livelihoods. In the People's Republic of China, wetland restoration through eco-compensation is improving biodiversity and tourism revenues. And in Sri Lanka, the restoration of Colombo's urban wetlands has reduced flood damage and boosted urban resilience. These examples show that when we treat ecosystems as assets, we create multiple dividends for people, economies, and for the planet. ADB is committed to supporting our developing member countries to scale up this transition. Through initiatives such as Nature Solutions Finance Hub, the ASEAN Catalytic Green Finance Facility, and Asia Pacific Natural Capital Fund, we are working to mobilize finance, strengthen policies, and scale nature-positive investments across the region. But finance alone will not be enough. We must combine it with technical assistance, knowledge sharing, and regional cooperation, so countries can learn from one another and accelerate implementation. As we look ahead, our task is clear. We must move beyond seeing nature as a background issue and make it central to how we define progress. So on behalf of the Chief Economist, Albert Park, and the EDB's leadership, I want to thank the report colleagues, Madhavi, Pundit, and Martino, Pelli, and all the contributors for these outstanding efforts. This report is not the end of the process. It's the beginning of conversation on how we can build economies that thrive because nature thrives. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Eugene. Let me now invite the two lead authors of the report, senior economists Martino, Pelli, and Madhavi Pundit, who will present in greater detail the main findings and policy recommendations from the report. Madhavi, floor is yours.
Thanks, Abdul. Let me start by setting the scene. Why do we focus on nature? Because nature is a core driver of economic performance. In Asia and the Pacific, an estimated 75% of value added, roughly $21 trillion, comes from sectors that are moderately or heavily dependent on nature. Analysis based on ADB's multi-regional input-output table highlights agriculture, fisheries, and tourism sectors. But it doesn't stop there. Almost every sector depends directly or indirectly on natural resources and ecosystem services. So the bottom line is that healthy ecosystems matter for the entire economy. For example, across the Pacific, ocean-based sectors contribute over 15% in many island economies and support over 2 million jobs. For communities in small island developing states, the ocean is core to their identity, prosperity, and resilience. Let's now build on this economic perspective. A key background paper for this report, written by researchers at Yale and the New York universities, developed a model that treats biodiversity not as an externality, but as a fundamental input to production, in the same way as labor and physical capital. The model is structured in two tiers, as you can see in the figure on the slide. On the top tier, the overall supply of ecosystem services is shown to depend on the combined output of multiple ecological functions, like pollination, water filtration, and soil formation. On the lower tier, each of those functions is generated by the interaction of many different species. And while species may perform similar roles, they do so in non-identical ways. This functional overlap provides resilience, ensuring that if one species is lost, others can step in. But this is possible only up to a point, as continued loss of species undermines ecosystem services and ultimately economic production. What this framework does is make explicit in an intuitive and tractable way how biodiversity underpins economic activity. By directly embedding nature into production, it highlights the contribution of ecosystems to the economy, as well as the risks of ongoing biodiversity loss. Importantly, it creates a tool for analyzing intertemporal choices, such as land use, capital allocation, or conservation policies, because the model shows how today's ecological decisions shape tomorrow's productive capacity. Healthy ecosystems deliver multiple dividends. They directly support public health, jobs, livelihood and productivity, fiscal stability, and climate resilience. Here are some examples based on diverse global studies. Safe water and sanitation reduces healthcare costs dramatically. National parks provide an estimated $2.2 trillion worth of mental health benefits every year. On livelihoods and productivity, a World Economic Forum study shows that a $2.7 trillion investment in sustainability could unlock more than $10 trillion in new business value and create 400 million jobs by 2030. On fiscal benefits, nature-based infrastructure often costs less than half of grey infrastructure while delivering better outcomes. Coral reefs, for example, already save millions in avoided storm damage across Pacific economies. On climate mitigation and resilience, healthy ecosystems act as natural climate buffers, from forests that store carbon to wetlands that reduce flooding. In our region, studies show that improved forest management could provide mitigation worth more than $3.6 trillion over 3 decades. And remember that these are only examples of quantifiable benefits of ecosystem services. The full value, as well as the cultural, intrinsic, and option values of nature, are even larger but harder to measure. Nature is not valuable only on its own. It plays an important role in climate action. When ecosystems are healthy, they reduce disaster risks, support livelihoods, and make economies more stable. That stability then creates stronger incentives to invest back into nature, reinforcing a virtuous cycle. The climate and nature goals are strongly aligned. If we fail to address nature loss, we undermine climate goals. And if we ignore climate risks, ecosystems degrade even faster. That's why integrated strategies that bring together nature protection, climate mitigation, and adaptation are essential for sustainable development. In this report, when we say nature, we mean biodiversity, water, and land, the renewable living and non-living components of the natural world. We are not talking about fossil fuels, metals, or minerals for the analysis in this report. Global momentum on valuing nature is building. Major institutional investors from BlackRock to the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund are integrating nature into their decisions. International frameworks like the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework and the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Development are setting common standards for investment and policy alignment. However, in the current context of weakening global coordination and declining official development assistance, integrating nature into fiscal, trade, and development frameworks is one of the strongest growth strategies available. Asia and the Pacific can lead this transition, positioning nature as a driver of economic competitiveness, resilience, and long-term prosperity. Regional platforms like ASEAN, CAREC, BIMPIAGA can help align standards and scale solutions. And ambitious national examples show the way forward. People's Republic of China's protected area policies, Thailand's biodiversity finance plan, and Uzbekistan's emissions trading legislation are just some examples. Well, the main message is that ecosystems are living infrastructure. If they collapse, our investment in transport, energy, agriculture, and water are all at risk. But if protected, they boost competitiveness, resilience, and fiscal space. From ADB's perspective, prioritizing nature is not optional. It is essential for safeguarding all our investments. This brings us to finance ministries, central banks, and economic planners. As nature directly affects macroeconomic stability, fiscal health, and sovereign risk, it becomes fundamental to the mandates of these institutions. With intensifying climate and nature shocks, degraded ecosystems mean higher disaster costs, disrupted revenue from nature dependent sectors, and greater fiscal volatility. At the same time, global capital markets are shifting. Access to finance, credit ratings, and investment flows are now linked to environmental performance. So, for finance and economic institutions, integrating nature is again not optional. It becomes essential for maintaining debt sustainability, attracting green investment, and staying competitive in a global economy that's increasingly driven by sustainability goals. In order to integrate nature into economic decision making, valuation is a first step. If nature is not measured, it gets left out of national accounts, fiscal planning, and investment strategies. This makes it invisible, which leads to degradation and underinvestment. Effective valuation, on the other hand, quantifies services, making visible the often hidden benefits that ecosystems provide. Valuation clarifies revenue models and supports the development of financial instruments like payments for ecosystem services, green bonds, and disclosure frameworks. It also underpins risk assessments and fiscal incentives. This is a pivotal moment as momentum is building across Asia and the Pacific. For example, Indonesia, the Philippines, and the PRC are already piloting natural capital accounts. But let's be clear, financing remains far below what is needed to protect, restore, and sustainably manage ecosystems at scale. The global biodiversity funding gap is now estimated at $940 billion per year, according to the Paulson Institute. That is the scale of the challenge. So the question is, why is investment still limited? Valuation alone is not enough to drive or make to make nature into a market-ready asset. Investment remains limited because markets fail to capture the full costs of degradation and the benefits of restoration. We discuss 5 key market failures. The first, externalities. For example, fertilizer runoff from farms can pollute rivers and wetlands, but the farm doesn't pay for the damage, environment and society do. Second, public goods. Benefits that everyone can use, like mangroves protecting coastal communities from storms. But because no one owns these benefits and it's hard to put a price on them, their restoration remains underfunded. Third, tragedy of the commons. Open access to fisheries and grazing lands leads to overuse and depletion of resources. Without clear property rights, this can also lead to conflicts and damage because no one feels responsible for managing the resource sustainably. 4, information gaps. Lack of transparency and clear information can lead to risky or inefficient decisions that end up harming ecosystems. And 5, short-termism. Quick profits from actions like cutting down forests ignores the long-term benefits like climate regulation, leading to unsustainable choices. The report highlights financial investment as a powerful lever to address these failures. Public finance can take early risks and mobilize markets, while private finance can bring scale, efficiency, and innovation. But finance alone is not enough. It must be embedded in a broader enabling framework that should support markets in internalizing environmental externalities and addressing market failures. The core issue is that the cost of degradation and the benefits of restoration should be reflected in market signals and economic decisions. How can this be addressed? To take us through the next set of slides, I hand it over to Martino.
Thank you, Madhavi, and thank you everybody for joining today. So how do we address this challenge? By upgrading what we can think of as the operating system composed of governance, policy, and data. These 3 pillars work together to enable nature finance. Governance sets the rules, policy drives implementation, and data provides the evidence base. These 3 pillars must be backed by crucial components like scientific measurement, accounting, and interoperable frameworks. Let's now walk through each one in turn. First, governance. Strong governance is about defining clear property rights, responsibilities, and rules for managing natural resources. This reduces risks and builds investor confidence. A crucial piece here is the environmental rule of law, which ensures that laws are enforced fairly and transparently. The environmental rule of law reduces market failures and strengthens trust. But governance is also about coordination across sectors, aligning policies to avoid conflicting mandates. And it has a strong social dimension, making sure local communities, indigenous people, and resource stewards are included and share benefits fairly. Let me give you an example. In 2024, the state of Victoria in Australia decided to end native logging in state forests. So environmental laws gave endangered species protection, community groups had legal standing in court, and an independent judiciary ruled against a state-owned enterprise that had violated environmental law. That's governance and environmental rule of law in practice, safeguarding natural capital. Second, policy. While governance sets the rules, policy turns them into action. Clear, consistent policy frameworks reduce uncertainty and give investors confidence. They create the economic signals needed to shift markets toward nature-positive outcomes. There are 4 big policy priorities we highlight. First, environmental pricing and fiscal incentives. They internalize the cost of degradation and reward conservation through taxes, fees, tradable permits, and targeted financial incentives. Second, phasing out harmful subsidies and redirecting support. This helps us to get rid of incentives that encourage unsustainable practices and shift public spending towards nature-positive alternatives. Third, creating predictable demand and investment, encouraging the use of regulation and public procurement to build stable, long-term demand for ecosystem services. Fourth, aligning with global market standards and trade frameworks so that domestic policies stay competitive and attract green investment. But policy is not just about correcting market failures. It also fosters innovation. Governments can support pilots, research, public-private partnerships, and build market infrastructure like registries. That helps reduce early-stage risks and opens new business models. In the Philippines, for instance, Executive Order 301 created the Green Procurement Program. Public agencies are encouraged to prioritize eco-friendly products when they buy. That kind of procurement creates steady demand, sends strong signals to suppliers, and helps new green products scale up, eventually shifting entire supply chains. Now let's turn to data. For nature to be treated as an asset, we need reliable, accessible, and decision-grade data. That means data that is accurate, consistent, comparable, and easy to use, just like economic data. The best systems are hybrid. Public agencies set standards and ensure quality, while private firms and communities provide the granular information on the ground. Good data is not just about transparency. It's about powering decision-making. Countries with reliable environmental economic data can forecast risks more accurately, strengthen fiscal planning, lower borrowing costs, and attract green investment. For example, omitting fish stocks or soil health from national accounts distorts productivity measures, forecasts, and even credit ratings. Organized, accessible data helps governments and firms reduce uncertainty, manage risks, and makes their economies more resilient. Countries are making progress. PRC uses gross ecosystem product to measure ecosystem services. Indonesia and the Philippines are piloting natural capital accounts under the UN SEA framework. And firms are moving ahead through the task force on nature-related financial disclosures, which pushes them to disclose nature-related risks. And finally, technology is transforming the picture. Satellite data, for example, through the EU's Copernicus program or Digital Earth Pacific, provide open monitoring of land use, carbon emission, and biodiversity. These innovations make environmental data not just available, but fit for purpose. Let's now bring the focus back to finance. To deliver nature-positive transformation, we need a full stack of both private and public finance. At the moment, private finance makes up only a small share of the total flows towards conservation and nature-based solutions. But it's critical because private investment brings innovation and helps scale solutions far beyond what public funds alone can do. Public finance, on the other hand, plays a catalytic role. Grants, guarantees, concessional loans, all of these are ways to absorb early risk and prepare projects. Multilateral development banks and DFIs can also use blended finance to attract private capital. By sharing risks, we bridge funding gaps and accelerate scaling. And let's not forget, some investments, like flood protection or coastal defense, may never yield direct private returns, but they deliver huge public benefits. Here, public finance is indispensable, especially when nature-based solutions offer a cheaper, more resilient alternative to gray infrastructure. Now, even when funding is available, many projects remain stuck at the pilot stage. It's not about a lack of ideas. It's about not being structured to attract capital. Investors look for scale, credibility, and financial performance. Without those, promising initiatives don't move forward. A background paper by Giles Davis and colleagues lays out 4 key criteria for investment-ready programs. First, scalable and strategic landscapes. We need to identify areas with high ecological value, clear threats, strong potential for restoration, clear land rights, and wider environmental benefits. Second, credible and capable counterparties. Investors back organizations they trust with good governance, solid operations, and clear financial disciplines. Counterparties also need strong local connections, a stake in long-term outcomes, and openness to technical collaboration. Third, well-structured risk management. Good project design reduces risk. Blended finance is one way to help absorb early-stage risk, but it's just part of the solution. Projects also need to be structured to scale small effort through aggregation, since most commercial financiers won't engage with fragmented, low-value deals. Smart design also includes diversifying revenue, securing predictable income, and linking returns to environmental outcomes. Fourth, built-in circularity. Programs should generate ongoing value, whether by monetizing ecosystem services, recycling funds, or reducing future costs in order to make projects sustainable in the long term. These four principles are what makes the difference between a pilot that stays small and a program that attracts serious private capital. Scale also matters in another way, the ecological and economic scale. Ecosystems do not function in fragments. They work across landscapes and seascapes. That's why the landscape approach is so powerful. It links upstream, midstream, and downstream actions, whether in water, food, energy, or disaster risk management, so that the results can multiply. Take Kenya's Upper Tana Basin. Upstream reforestation reduced sediment flows by 23,000 tons each year. That cut water treatment costs by $250,000. And finally, farmers boosted yields by up to 15%. Regional cooperation adds another layer of impact. The East Asian Australasian Flyway Initiative is a great example. Wetlands are being restored along migratory bird routes, combining biodiversity benefits with resilience and shared economic value. The good news is that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. The opportunity lies in upgrading systems that already exist. Tools like payment for ecosystem services, climate budget tagging, and biodiversity or carbon credits are working. The challenge is scaling them and embedding them into national systems. Once governments integrate these tools into budgets, strategies, and performance frameworks, the outcomes, like reduced flood damage or increased farm productivity, get treated as economic output. That changes how risks and investments are assessed. Of course, every country starts from a different place. That's why the report lays out a phased 10-year roadmap, a practical, capacity-tailored sequence. So in phase 0, governments should conduct a comprehensive assessment of existing initiatives, governance structures, data capabilities, and financial frameworks, while fostering stakeholder awareness and engagement. In phase 1, they can begin with simple actions, such as mapping key ecosystems using accessible data and geospatial tools. We can also start accounting for ecosystem services with market value, especially those supporting the most important economic sectors in the country. In phase 2, governments can move on to adopting advanced instruments like full natural capital accounting, ecosystem service valuation, and landscape-scale governance as capacity grows. Finally, in phase 3, we need to strengthen national platforms and integrate with regional frameworks such as ASEAN or CAREC. Throughout this journey, capacity building and good governance are essential, so communities benefit and ecosystems are protected. And for nature-rich, lower-income economies, acting early means turning ecosystems into competitive advantages before degradation locks in irreversible losses. This brings us to the end of the presentation. The core message is clear. By upgrading governance, policy, and data, the operating system for nature finance, we can scale investment, create real markets, and deliver sustainable development outcome. Now, before ending, let me take a moment to thank, from myself and my colleague, Madhavi Pundit, to thank a few people without whom this report would not have been possible. And please forgive me if I forget someone, but I will try not to. First, I think we have to give our great appreciation to our small team, Jindra Samson, Dorothy Bantazan, Melanie Quintos, Amanda Mammon, and Diane Bennett Zeda Cruz. Without their tireless effort, we wouldn't have a report today. Let me also extend a very heartfelt thanks to all our ADB colleagues and to ERDI, CCSD, and ERD management for their support. A special thanks to the Expert Advisory Committee, which always pushed us further, and to all the contributors of the 16 background papers that provide the scientific foundation for this report. So thank you very much for your attention, and now I look forward to the comment from the panelists and from the rest of the audience. Thank you.
Many thanks for that very interesting presentation, Madhavi and Martino. There's clearly a lot of content in the report, and I know there's a lot more of it that you didn't get to cover in this brief presentation. So I invite the audience to download the report. The link is available in the chat. And as Martino mentioned, apart from the report itself, there are the 16 background papers that provided the foundations for the report, and you can find the link to that in the report page. So let's now turn to the panel discussion of this webinar, for which we are joined by several experts. Simon Zadek is co-founder and managing partner of Morphosis, an adaptation solutions platform, and he's also Distinguished Fellow at the Hoffman Center for Global Sustainability at the Graduate Institute in Switzerland. Noralene M is Assistant Secretary for Policy, Planning, International Affairs, and Climate Change of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources in the Philippines. She negotiates the adaptation workstream for the Philippine delegation in the UNFCCC processes. Esha Zaveri is a senior economist in the Office of the Chief Economist of the Planet Vice Presidency at the World Bank, and she's one of the authors of the new World Bank report, Reboot Development, The Economics of a Livable Planet. And Yoko Watanabe is the Director of Environment at the Asian Development Bank. She heads the environment and nature initiatives, including biodiversity conservation and ecosystem management, nature-based solutions, and air quality and circular economy. So thanks for joining us in this webinar. And so let me start with you, Simon. Martino and Madhavi had highlighted the need to scale up nature finance, but private capital remains largely untapped. And in fact, one of our seminar, somebody in the audience, Tigran Pogoshan, had also raised this. What, in your view, are the most promising strategies to mobilize private investors while ensuring that nature-positive outcomes remain credible and inclusive?
Thanks, Abdul, and thank you for the invitation to join this session. Since Martino and Madhavi can't congratulate themselves, I'd like to just sort of add a thanks and acknowledgement to them both for their absolutely fantastic leadership in developing this report. And for those with a memory of how the nature finance agenda has really evolved over the last 5 years, it is quite extraordinary that we're having this conversation where perhaps 5 or 6 years ago, we would be still mired in a fairly old-fashioned incremental discussion about conservation finance. So big step forward for the ADB, by the ADB, with this report, but as an overall development trajectory of the nature finance community. So in Martino and Madhavi's comments, much was said about the private sector, and I think very eloquently and clearly, but ultimately the question returns, where's the money coming from? Who is going to pay for nature, and why are they going to pay for nature if they're operating through a commercial logic? And that seems to me to be the art of harnessing private finance without having to, if you like, overly subsidize it through expensive and restricted scale blended finance instruments. So I just want to highlight a kind of few of the routes that we see emerging in practice on the ground. But probably the simplest it is really through a risk lens for companies that are managing global supply chains that have high dependency on nature, need to build a robustness of those supply chains, ensure the security of supply. We're seeing investment to improve the resilience of those supply chains. And that sounds, remarkably obvious, but actually, in many cases, think of agricultural supply chains as the most obvious case in point. It's actually quite recent that we see investment coming down those supply chains to really safeguard the value and the productivity contributions that critical nature assets are making to delivering quality, high productivity, nature-related products and services. So that will grow, and of course it will grow even more quickly in the context of climate change that is streaking through our 1.5 degree target set in 2015, where many of those nature assets are increasingly at threat, placing challenges for companies, say, buying cocoa or timber products to ensure a security of supply. So that is and will continue to grow. I think the second side of the story has more to do with the productivity of the land itself. And we see a growing investment in multiple forms of land restoration and preservation, in part, in a classical form, in order to harvest what we've harvested for decades and generations, but also to harvest new forms of value. And I would point most obviously to carbon markets, so increasing investment in nature restoration in order to be able to extract carbon-related income, and coming up sort of fast behind those carbon markets, biodiversity credit markets in various different forms, beginning to play an important role. And just touching on those biodiversity credit markets, that links through to something, Martino, that you said in your presentation, which is policy is not just about compliance, but compliance can actually also drive the development of nature markets that channels investment into nature restoration. And I think, for example, of the US wetlands markets, about $8 billion using a habitat bank model, now adopted a number of years ago in Colombia, and really pushing beyond the compliance agenda to a local compensation model that in turn is generating, for example, voluntary biodiversity credit markets, channeling funds into nature restoration. And we're now seeing that across 20 or 30 different countries, global north, the global south, different regions of the world, different forms of biodiversity credit markets emerging. And we would expect over the next 3-5 years, say, to begin increasingly to see biodiversity credit markets and carbon markets beginning to be integrated in what we might broadly think of as a new generation of nature credit markets, driven by a multiple set of factors, including policy-based comply and compensate approaches. Let me add in perhaps a sort of another layer of answers to where that money comes from. The G20 under the Brazilian presidency last year launched a new initiative on the bioeconomy. And in that initiative, it clarified the breadth of the bioeconomy as it is beginning to emerge and generate new innovations, enterprises, sectors, value and employment. You have obviously the sort of nature-intensive side of it, the forest economy of the Amazon being the most obvious case in point. One has photosynthetic with technology value added, biofuels, and many other sectors that involve growing but adding technology to it for a new generation of products, sustainable aviation fuel being a case in point. And then that very sort of high-tech area, the whole biopharmaceutical space, for example, again, using biodiversity in order to generate the next generation of medical solutions to some of the diseases we're trying to address. All of these developments are attracting more and more investment. And some of that investment is in high tech, but much of that investment is really being channeled into nature restoration and preservation, extraction and payment for specific biodiversity assets in order to drive what is a real next generation of technologies, businesses and sectors forward, going forward. And perhaps just one more example, Abdul, and then I'll pass back to you, which is asset protection. So let me take the example briefly of Los Angeles, burning buildings. Of course, we all have emblazoned in our minds. It turns out that if the nature assets surrounding the Los Angeles basin had been better protected, that damage would certainly have been an awful lot lower. And we begin to see now new public-private partnerships involving private investment from capital markets and public policy and some public finance beginning to be channeled into nature restoration in order to protect distressed or potentially distressed economic assets, whether it's property, whether it's other kinds of farmland, whether it's mobility infrastructure like roads and railways and so on. So I think in conclusion, we can sort of put to bed the question, where's the money going to come from, by pointing to this range of different ways in which private capital will increasingly be mobilized, ultimately in support of nature restoration and conservation, but instrumentally in order to create economic value in these diverse and important ways. Abdul, thank you.
Great. Thanks very much for that. Thanks very much for that, Simon. So yeah, obviously finance being a very important part of this. Another important part would be planning and policy. So let me actually turn to Assistant Secretary Noralene. The Philippines has been a regional leader in nature positive policy, from community-based forest management to this landmark PENCAS law, which established the Philippine Ecosystem and Natural Capital Accounting System. It'll be interesting to hear what were the key enablers that allowed this, and how is DENR building on this momentum?
Thanks very much, Abdul, and thank you, ADB, for the invitation to be part of this panel, and congratulations on this report. Now, to answer your question, under the present administration, the government emphasizes that natural capital must underpin and spur our socio-economic development. Among the first tasks that the Department of Environment and Natural Resources undertook was to establish the National Natural Resources Geospatial Database, which allowed us to map and measure our natural wealth. We also adopted nature-based solutions and a ridge to reef to shelf approach as our core strategies. The subsequent passage of the Philippine Ecosystem and Natural Capital Accounting System, or PENCAS Act, in 2024 provided us the legal basis to establish a mechanism for systematically accounting for the country's ecosystems and natural resources, particularly their inherent ecosystem services. The law also serves as the foundation for institutionalizing natural capital accounting across government agencies for risk-informed environmental monitoring, economic planning, and policymaking. As an example, site-specific ecosystems accounts that we have developed so far, for example, for highly at-risk areas, allowed us to assign values and estimate losses and damage to biodiversity and ecosystems that serve as input to our loss and damage database and included in post-disaster needs assessment. Now able to focus on nature positive policymaking at this time. One would be the decades of groundwork, for example, in the natural capital accounting, and the strong collaboration among key agencies and institutions in the country. Secondly, the recognition that as one of the most mega diverse countries in the world, there is an urgency for the Philippines to conserve, manage, and protect our environment and natural resources against the impacts of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. And finally, the increasing partnerships on environmental conservation with various stakeholders, CSOs, academia, private sector, development partners, and local governments and communities that enabled scaling up. During the Philippines chairship of ASEAN in 2026, the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, as chair of the ASEAN senior officials on environment, will continue to work alongside ASEAN member states to accelerate nature positive actions in the region. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Asek Noralene. I mean, so yeah, good to hear. I mean, the Philippines can use ASEAN next year as a platform to show other countries what you guys have been doing. And I think your question helped answer your answer helped touched on one of the questions posted in the Q&A from Tigran on fragmentation between ensuring sort of a holistic response across governments and the governance reforms that have been successful in aligning mandates for nature finance. But I think maybe Esha can also touch on that. Esha, the Asia Pacific Climate Report highlights how environmental degradation across air, land, and water disproportionately affects vulnerable populations. Drawing on your work in the World Bank's Reboot Development Report, can you elaborate on how development planning in the region can better reflect these interlinked stressors and also avoid siloed responses?
Thank you very much, Abdul. And I also want to congratulate the authors on a fantastic report. It was clearly music to my ears, having just co-authored the Reboot Development Report, the flagship report for the World Bank. And what was very nice to see even in this work, and that's something that we argue for as well, is that the economy is embedded in nature and cannot exist apart from it. And so there is this growing recognition that economic development, cannot be sustained without safeguarding the ecosystems that support it. And in our report, we show that environmental degradation of land, air, and water are critical natural assets, is transforming the very logic of development. It's beginning to shape productivity, prices, and comparative advantage as profoundly as labor and capital once did. And what we see in globally looking at the data, we find that over 90% of the world's population faces poor air, degraded land, or water stress. In low-income countries, 80% of the inhabitants face all three hazards: bad air, bad land, bad water. And so closing the development gap really requires integrated solutions that address both poverty and environmental degradation together. And I think in Madhavi's and Martino's presentation, that came out very, very clearly. I think the other important point, and in your question, was that many of these stressors, they co-occur. They're occurring at the same time. So addressing one environmental stressor in isolation may provide limited benefits. It could also lead to unintended consequences in another sector if policy interventions are not appropriately designed. And so I think when we think of development planning, these policies really need to think in systems. So we need a systems approach because problems and policies, they often spill across sectors and borders. So for example, a crackdown on deforestation in one area can simply push agriculture into another, a phenomenon we call leakage in economics. And without coordination, policies also risk being fragmented or counterproductive. So siting hydropower in ways that could damage habitats and wildlife. And so we really need more collaboration across ministries to design holistic policies. We also need to think of multiple tools because one lever rarely does it. So when we think of agricultural subsidy reform, for example, it often works better when it is paired with extension services that also help farmers adopt sustainable practices. So we're reducing land conversion as well as boosting productivity at the same time. And third, we need to clear some of these adoption hurdles. So in this respect, if you think of innovation, for example, it is often path dependent. So even if better technologies exist, they can stall because there is not enough uptake. So alongside fixing these environmental issues, we also need support for uptake. And this is something that other panelists have spoken about. And so this is finance, information, and capability so that many of these good ideas can actually scale. And finally, I think no policy will stick if it's not politically palatable and feasible. And so I think it's really important to look at vested interests, the stakeholders, who stands to gain or lose from a policy matters just as much as the policy itself. And so if we want to craft implementable reforms, we need to align these incentives. We also need to think of sequencing these reforms very carefully and building coalitions that can overcome resistance. So I think in summary, I would say 3 broad principles are really key when we think of development planning. First is investing in better information, because I think this is really important to empower citizens and improve how we monitor and manage problems. Second, strengthening coordination, so policies across sectors work together and not at cross purposes. And third, I think we also need to create a culture of evaluation. So we test, we learn, we adapt, so countries can avoid fragmented fixes and instead they can build or chart a path that links, all these natural assets that we spoke of and the people, because we're all embedded in the biosphere, so that we can chart a path into a livable future.
Great. Thanks very much for that, Esha. Oops, I'm not muted, am I? Yeah. So a lot of what the points you made sort of really link up with those improvements in the operating system that Martino and Madhavi talked about. Let me now turn to Yoko, since first there were a couple of questions in the chat relating to what ADB is doing. So Yoko, the report highlights that 75% of Asia Pacific's value added depends on nature. How is ADB embedding this recognition into its operations, whether project design, country programming, and policy dialogue? And given that there was a question from Jose Felisco about sort of how ADB is helping the Philippines specifically and on biodiversity. There was also a question, if you have time and you can touch on it, from Leonel De Leon asking about if climate-aligned startups or SMEs work, whether there's a way that they can get ADB support in developing verified green bond projects or pilots, in case you can touch on that as well. So let me pass it to you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for having this opportunity. And this is really a landmark opportunity to have this report, launched and shared, and bringing, again, as Eugene said in the beginning, nature as not as a cost, and bringing it as a capital and foundation for our society and economy. So from Asian Development Bank, this is really an opportunity to scale up our work in enabling nature positive investment and also mainstreaming nature in our sector work. So as you may know, we have actually launched our new environmental action plan of 2024 to 2030 last year, approved by our president after consultation with our board and all staff across, all teams across ADB working on this new environmental action plan that gives actually a roadmap on how we're going to further invest in nature. And so there's actually 3 ways I would kind of summarize how we're planning to do. First is to really expand nature positive investment. So what do we mean by that? So we've heard already from Madhavi and also Martino that it's really the nature is a basis and foundation of our economy. And for doing so, we really need to focus on biodiversity and natural resource conservation and sustainable use. So in ADB, we are engaging and increasing our portfolio on wetland conservation, forest conservation, watershed, and also coastal and ocean conservation, and ensure that the ecosystem health is ensured and strengthened. And then the second really important sort of way of investing in nature is really mainstream nature across operation. The World Bank colleague just mentioned that we really need to have a more coherent approach among sectors. And it's not an issue just environment ministry working on nature issues, but finance and all sectors like energy, transport, and agriculture and others to really step up and work together and see what we can do. So in that regard, in ADB, we are investing a lot on infrastructure, of course, but see nature as a core sort of infrastructure and see how we can mix gray and green infrastructure, like working on Sponge City and ensure that there is wetlands and watershed around the cities so that can provide not only water, but also use it as a disaster risk prevention on flood control and others. We're also working on wildlife-friendly infrastructure, ensuring that wildlife corridors and forest corridors are conserved. So there is a really important elements that we can really integrate those environmental work in our investment. And in that regard, in Philippines, we are working, first of all, as highlighted by my prior speaker from DNR, we've been supporting on the natural capital accounting and valuation through our technical assistance. We are actually moving forward and now working on the regional flyway initiative conservation on the key wetlands in Philippines using the GEF resources and scale those initiatives on the ground and have concrete benefit not on the wetland conservation only, but tourism and agriculture and rural development in general with indigenous peoples and local communities. So there is increasing portfolio working in Philippines on wildlife management as well as ecosystem management. And thirdly, as an approach, I would like to emphasize that we have updated our environment and social framework, and this is really important to ensure that all our financed operation and investment, both public and private, will avoid, mitigate, and minimize harm to nature and protect biodiversity, and also enable inclusive approach and conservation on the ground. And also to do that, I just really want to emphasize that ADB has multiple sort of instruments and approaches to do that. In terms of technical and financial support, we have technical assistance and policy dialogue to have that sort of coherent and integrated approach in terms of policy and investment is concerned. And also to enable that the National Determined Contribution and the Biodiversity National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan to be updated and have a coherent sort of approach towards it. Also very important is nature is sometimes a very new thing in Asia and Pacific to work with. So knowledge and capacity building on these areas of work are really important, and we are increasing our efforts on that ground. And we have been providing technical support and trainings and workshops across the region. And one of those tools that we have developed is the National Nature Solutions Finance Hub to scale up nature investment across Asia and Pacific. This is an ambition to increase up to 5 billion investment to 2030. And under that, we are also employing new sort of innovative financing mechanism like the first biodiversity bond that we issued last year, and also supporting countries to issue these sustainability linked bonds like Thailand and Malaysia. We're supporting those initiatives on the country level. And then also using blended finance, insurance, guarantee mechanism to scale these initiatives. And finally, like Simon mentioned, biodiversity credit is a new area of work that we can really scale up investment from private capital. And we are looking into applying those through the Regional Flyway Initiative and other mechanisms. So with that, hope it kind of pictured what ADB is stepping up to do together with partners. Many different bilateral and multilateral funders are working on this field. We're working together to scale up in Nature Solutions Finance Hub. And also we are taking leadership among the MDB's Nature Group so that we can scale together with MDB's, all the agencies that are committed to scale up nature, like the World Bank colleagues and others who have been presented today. So thank you very much again.
Thanks very much, Yoko. I realize we're coming close to the hour. There was a question from Tirta Tamang on stewardship, another from Romy Virola on governance. Martino, you want to take one or both of those questions?
Yes, thank you, Abdul. I'll be very short. I think, and that's why in the report, as Madhavi said in her part of the presentation, this is a pivotal moment for public sector to step in and create these enabling conditions. And in one of the first component of the operating system, it's governance, good governance. And, one fundamental, so there are two pieces of good governance. First of all, we should set the right set of rules, and this should really come from the bottom up. We have to acknowledge that a lot of the stewardship of nature in the world at the moment is done by a very few people. And we need to have clear rules to govern benefit sharing and to acknowledge the work they do for all of us. The other component of governance is the environmental rule of law. It's not sufficient to have good rules, but we need to enforce them, right? And this tackles the side, we would hope it would tackle the side of corruption that was mentioned. And so, for instance, at the moment at ADB, we are starting a project where we are discussing with some of our member countries about evaluating their environmental rule of law to see what policy reforms are needed and how we can strengthen this part of the governance bit. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Martino. We've hit the hour mark, and the end of our seminar. And so I wanted to thank our panelists and presenters and Eugene as well for a very interesting discussion. Before we close today's seminar, I'd like to invite all of you to join our next Asian Impact webinar, which is titled Skills That Pay, Demand for Digital and AI Skills in Asia and the Pacific. That's going to be held on the 24th of November, Monday, from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. Manila time, again, online via Zoom. Please also check out the Asian Impact webinar page and the Chief Economist's X account for more updates. Thank you again to our panelists, presenters, and to all of you in the audience for being here and being part of a very stimulating discussion. Thank you and see you again.